Hi, everyone. Welcome back to The Long View. I'm very excited to be here with Christina Greer, who is a terrific political scientist of American politics and also the co-host of a podcast, which is I've been listening to. And I really enjoy FAQ NYC,
Mm.
which is she and Harry Siegel cover it's weekly New York City politics in thoughtful ways. So welcome to The Long View.
Thanks. I've never been here before. This is fantastic. This is my first
Welcome to Substack.
Substack Live.
Awesome. I think we've been on TV together, and it's
Mhm.
nice to be in this world. I wanted to start. I mean, so you've been covering and talking a lot about New York City's Mayor Mamdani, and one issue you've talked a lot about is a lack of racial diversity that you've pointed to in the cabinet. Can you explain a little bit about what you're seeing, and maybe how it even compares with some other mayors in the city in previous years?
Yeah, and so thanks for having me, Julian. So this particular mayor has gone out of his way to have a really diverse set of commissioners and folks in his orbit. We've never seen this type of religious diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity. I mean, Eric Adams did a lot with sort of having female commissioners, and Mamdani is continuing that mantle. I think the difference for me, and what I talk about a lot on FAQ, is that they're the commissioners and then they're the deputy mayors. And in my estimation, deputy mayors are more in an advisory capacity, and commissioners are people who go out and execute your mission. And we know that Mamdani has some big lofty ideals that he wants to implement. For me to not have any black deputy mayors, and I mean, Bloomberg had a black deputy mayor, so you know that that's like that was a long time ago, 2001. As did De Blasio and Adams, and so now we're deep into the 21st century, and we have someone who's been cognizant of making sure that you've got a Jamaican American schools chancellor and a Haitian American public health commissioner, and Afia Atament's is Ghanaian, and she's the Commissioner of Equity and Racial Justice, and there's some few others. But as far as like advisory capacity for a city that's almost a quarter African American, you don't have any in your deputy mayor advisory capacity. So the one person who really does advise him is Patrick Gaspard, who many of your viewers may know was an advisor to Obama, then became Obama's South African ambassador. He helped deliver De Blasio into the mayoralty in 2013. He worked on Maya Wiley's campaign in 2021, which obviously she was not successful. But Patrick Gaspard is a brilliant political mind. Obviously, lots of strength in unions. But as far as 2026 is concerned, I'm looking at, well, he's already been there, right? And so
Mhm.
when I explain to electeds, a lot of times we say they live in a bubble. And I'm like, you don't live in a bubble. You live in a garage because a bubble you can see around, right? A garage, you only have those three little windows and you're looking there. And in many ways, the mayor is in a garage and he has to trust his advisors with what's going on. And my argument is that Patrick Gaspard has already been in the garage. Like he was in the garage when the mayor joined him. So who is on the outside advising him for issues that are of great import? Because we know, sadly, that there will be a racial issue that comes up in the next 4 years. And to not have any sort of Black advisors is of great concern to me. Jeff Mays has written about it in the Times. We can talk about even more specifically. I wrote a book called Black Ethnics. There are no Black American uh, people in high capacity in this administration. So, for a population that did help deliver him into the mayoralty and can also make sure he stays in the mayoralty, I think that that's one of the blind spots that I've been looking at.
And can you just talk a little more about the political risks that this entails? I mean, there's obviously just a normative, moral question about what diversity means for a mayor. But the garage and events happening and crises happening at a political level, what are some of the risks that can happen to a mayor when they close themselves off from populations such as this?
Well, I mean, don't forget, Black Americans specifically, and we'll say Black people, but like Black Americans more specifically, are the canaries in the mine. We have been the ones that sort of let everyone else know the dangers that lie ahead. If I want to be really explicit, should say Black women. Um, and so we know that as issues come up, whether it's in education, whether it's a policing issue in a particular community, Once the horses left the barn, that is not the time to come to the Black community and also Black legacy organizations that have laid a foundation for all the other organizations to build upon to say, okay, now I need some help. What should I do? Because then you'll get assistance, but it says a lot that you did not think to have these people in your inner circle from the beginning. You would think to have them in your inner circle once a crisis has occurred, usually in a policy perspective. And so it's not too late to rectify the situation, but it does signal. And I've had lots of issues with the DSA. If you listen to the podcast, you
Hmm.
know that I am not a fan of the DSA, largely because of their reliance on a class analysis and a lack of racial analysis. And in my estimation, the sort of Bernie Sanders class analysis without race in America is absolutely absurd to me. And so I'm under the bell hooks line of thinking where if this is a country predicated on patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, and anti Black racism. And those are the four legs of the table. How can we ever have a conversation about class without explicitly talking about race, let alone even more explicitly talking about anti Black racism in particular? And so, as Black populations leave the city, it one would think that, oh, well, they're not as important, right? We have all these growing populations. The populations that Cuomo did not understand were there and could not understand how they were participants in voting and so active. But we also must recognize that many of those organizations take their tactics and the foundation of their intellectual being from many of the struggles of the civil rights movement and African American led movements over the past 50 to 60 years. So to ignore that would be a great disservice to the mayor when something happens down the line, which sadly we know will most likely occur.
I mean, from following the DSA, just to understand the background of the mayor, is this a conscious choice? I mean, is it an oversight or is it a decision that that kind of racial analysis or a kind of race-based analysis should be excluded for class-based analysis?
I'm not exactly sure, Julian,
Yeah.
because on the one hand, we're dealing with someone who's 34, right? And so, like, younger people grew up in a different New York City, they grew up in a different America where they talk about race differently. And it's not even in this dichotomous or even trichotomous way that many of us grew up talking about, sort of black and white or black, white, Latino, right? It's much more inclusive. We have Asian and AAPI populations, it's much more a religious diversity. A geographic diversity. I mean, there are way more transplants in New York. So this regenerative city is different for someone who's 34, honestly, than someone who's 54, right? But I also think that because his political foundation is the DSA, and this is someone who's, raised on the Upper West Side. Yes, he is born on the continent of Africa. His father is very firm that they are Africans of Indian descent. That is his father's definition. I've actually never heard the mayor explicitly describe himself as such. Um, but for someone who grew up on the Upper West Side, went to the schools that he went to, Bank Street and Bronx Science and Bowdoin. Um, there's a lot of reliance on sort of, if we look at just alleviating class struggles, we can move beyond this, which as someone who studies race and ethnic politics, I think that's a farce. And I think it's a short sighted way of understanding this city. So I don't think it's malicious, but I do think that at this particular position for the mayor, we have to understand that the DSA's definition of class based analyses will not suit the mayor moving forward as a representative of roughly 9 million New Yorkers in a city that has a long history of race and racism, and how mayors have had to tackle this long history of race and racism. And I've been very clear that this mayor should look at the struggles of and triumphs of LaGuardia, Lindsay, Dinkins, and Bloomberg as his guide, because I think those four mayors really encapsulate a leading principle for him as he tries to move the city deeper into the 21st century. I mean, it's crazy to think, but we are now one quarter into the 21st century, and we're 25 years away from 9/11, which created some real distinct class conversations and racial and religious conversations as well for a city that we began to have, but we never fully resolved.
One other thing, a comment you made once on one of your episodes was that his support is broad, but it's thin. And I'm curious if
Wide
you
but
could
not deep.
expand. Yeah, or why, but not deep. Can you explain what that means and what the implications are?
Yeah, so like in, political science theory, and so the great thing is on the podcast, I'm just sort of talking and I'm it, but it's like
Yeah,
my opinions are based in like 30 years of political science research, right? I'm not always like giving you citations, but it's like these are political
right.
science theories. These aren't just my feelings. And so, when we think about someone like Machiavelli who talks about, provinces easily won or easily lost, because Mamdani is a once in a generation talent, and he was polling at roughly 1% this time last year, and he was able to easily come in and just inspire people. There's a hope, there's a joy. I call it sort of like a Jimmy Carter quality for me, like a genuine interest in knowing how you're doing and how you're feeling and how your family's doing. And so because of that, lots of people jumped on the bandwagon, and they're very new to the bandwagon because he's also very new to politics. That's not a fault of his, it's just a reality. And so, because of that, he was able to garner a really broad, wide swath of New Yorkers who were really excited about his candidacy and showed up in June and showed up even more so in November. But because of that, it's a new crop of people who are very excited about him. So it's wide, but it is not deep. He does not have deep roots in any community, realistically, especially the Black community. And we know that Black voters tend to be highly strategic. This is why many Black voters were with Andrew Cuomo in the primary, not because they love Andrew Cuomo, but because they knew his dad and they knew he was a name, and they did not know who this 34-year-old South Asian guy from Queens who talks about democratic socialism was. And Black voters go to the polls having to think about how white voters are going to behave. So sometimes you vote for your second or even third choice candidate because you'd rather get something as opposed to nothing, because Black voters do know what it feels like to get nothing. And this is the first time I think a lot of white voters are seeing on the national level what it feels like to get nothing. And Black voters are like, "Welcome to the party." This is what American democracy can look like and has looked like for Black voters for a myriad of years, decades even. So I think that this widespread support that he came in on is such that it can change. And so, yes, his polling numbers show that, Black voters are with him, but because Black voters are under the constraints of non-white executives, they understand the constraints that he's under, the death threats, and so this Obama-esque level of being the first, but also because it's not deep, they can move on without him next June, realistically, or November, whatever it may look like. And so, keeping in mind that maybe Black people didn't get you to the party initially in the June 24th primary, they did help get you across the finish line in November, but they will definitely be an obstacle if ignored in whatever pursuits you have in 4 years.
What do you think? I mean, I don't know if you agree, but often talk about honeymoon periods and first 100 days can be overblown. But this mayor had an ambitious agenda, and he's been facing in New York ice and snow, which is the realities of city politics. And it's been a while now. It wasn't a one-day event. I'm curious, what do you think this will impact him politically? Not how he handled it, but the amount of time that has now been consumed on this at this
Yeah.
critical moment. Or can he move back to affordability, housing, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about being a mayor, right? There are expectations of a mayor that no other elected official has. No one expects Chuck Schumer to deal with the snow, or Hakeem Jeffries, or even Kathy Hochul or Donald Trump. It's I always tell my students two things. One, they always say being a mayor is like changing your bike tire in the middle of the Tour de France. Like, it's moving, right? It's a 40-hour-a-day job. And LBJ, who is my favorite president, when they asked him in the 60s, like, so, how are you doing, right? There's a civil rights movement. Cities are on fire. Vietnam is a mess. Soldiers are being brought over, in body bags. Like, everything seems to be going wrong under your watch. What do you have to say about that? And he says, well, it could be worse. I could be a mayor, right? He recognizes that, like, that job and the expectations of the job are supersede even that of a presidency in many ways. And so, is the mayor in charge of global warming? No, because of this snow and the ice that refuses to melt, like, it's on his watch. However, people are looking at him like, where is my sanitation department, right? Where is the snow removal? Why aren't the cars being, shoveled out? Why all these things when are the kids going in? He's got a few things working for him. One, he communicates very well. He's like the opposite of the Obama administration. They do communicate. I'm always curious though, will it get to be a point of, are you over communicating? Are you over communicating and not working? At least that may be the perception. We have these arbitrary 100 days, as you said, April 10th. He has some lofty goals, right? With racial and equity and racial justice. He wants some big reports out. I think he wants to show that he'll have some sort of movement on bus lanes. Obviously, Tin Cup Day in Albany was last week or a few days ago. The good thing that he does have is that, Kathy Hochul's up for reelection. She understands that she needs him to deliver downstate in a robust way. So they're working together, which bodes well for both of them, but especially New Yorkers who need the resources. I think because we enacted some of these policies during COVID, they may feel new to some people, but they're actually not new. We did have free buses during COVID. We did have rent freezes during COVID. We did sort of versions of this during COVID. So if he can get some pilot programs off the ground, at least by June, to say these first 6 months, here are the things that I've done. And because he's been able to communicate quite effectively, um, I do think that voters will give him a bit of grace. I also think because the last two mayors did not seem as though they were that interested in being mayor, that gives him, at least for now in these first few months, a little bit of an extra cushion. Don't forget, de Blasio worked for 2 years and then took off for 6 years and no policy. He's running for president. He's everywhere but New York. Eric Adams at the clubs. So at least this feels as though we have someone who has a mixture of veterans and new folks working in conjunction on complicated policy issues with an erratic and irrational and unstable federal government and a governor that at least is trying to play both sides of the balance beam with an extremely draconian and conservative president and a much more progressive liberal thinking democratic socialist mayor. So as of now, I think people are willing to give him grace because it looks like he's actually trying to solve some issues that were left by the wayside by not just the Adams administration, but if we're being honest, by the de Blasio administration as well, and by the Bloomberg administration, because Bloomberg's lack of class analysis was rampant, and Giuliani and his lack of racial analysis was rampant. So we can keep going back for all these communities that were ignored explicitly by particular mayors. And at least this particular mayor is saying, well, I'm trying to piece together all these people who've been ignored and bring them together and figure out what we can do for affordability so we don't lose more New Yorkers and not just Black New Yorkers, but New Yorkers full stop.
Do you have any sense of how you talk about the governor, but how are his relationships with the city council, the other kind of source of power in the city? Do we have a sense of that yet?
Well, so here's the thing, he doesn't come from the city council. So he was in the state legislature
Right.
in Albany. He knows them. I mean, here's the thing for your viewers out there. New York is a tiny town. I tell my students that time and time again. It's the smallest town you'll ever live in. Keep your nose clean. You will see all of these people again and again. So he knows them. I think having Julie Menon as the speaker of the city council, who has essentially positioned herself as a foil to the mayor, is not always going to be the easiest job. One, as she campaigned, like sort of essentially, I'm going to be a Jewish speaker, implicitly for certain populations is saying, because he's a Muslim mayor and I'm the Jewish speaker, I will be a foil, which rubs some people the wrong way because when we had our Bloomberg as a Jewish mayor, we didn't sort of hear people say we need a Muslim speaker as a foil. But she is also, if you look at her policies from the past when she was in city council, she's much more moderate than the mayor. So she represents a lot of her colleagues who are not in the progressive caucus of the city council. And we have to recognize New York City is not a deep blue city at all. Don't forget, we had 20 years of Republican mayors. So we are purple very clearly. So I think that there are going to be lots of compromises, which I think is healthy for democracy. And, some of the DSA members that we interviewed on the podcast were just like, we don't believe in compromise. And I was like, well, first of all, compromise is the essence of democracy. Without compromise, we have dictatorships. So I think some of the struggles that he'll have aren't necessarily with city council and the more conservative members of city council. It might be with his own DSA members who feel as though he's moving too far to the center. But if you look at the diverse population of New York, and when I say diverse, I mean that in all senses of the word,
Mhm.
for him to govern to the far, far left is actually not doing a service to the vast majority of New Yorkers who are not on the far, far left. I think some of his issues cross the board, right? Lots of people can respect and understand this idea of affordability, even if you're not a democratic socialist. There's so many New Yorkers, as I say all the time, if you make $40,000 or $400,000, so many New Yorkers are feeling the squeeze in that range. So he spoke to them, and I think that explains how he got in office. But to govern purely from a democratic socialist lens only, he is quickly recognizing that he has to be much more broad. And I think that having Menon kind of pull him to the center at times will give him some sort of cover sometimes with his own base, which is the Democratic Socialist Party.
Before I turn to my final two questions, let me thank all the subscribers who are watching us now. And we have a nice crowd and who will watch us later when I post this. And thank you, paid subscribers, for allowing the long view to happen and facilitating this independent journalism. And if some of you will consider becoming paid subscribers, I appreciate it very much. The last question on the city I wanted to ask is, there's a fiscal straitjacket, so to speak, on the city, which he has talked about. And this is not unfamiliar in politics. How do you think it will impact a mayor with a pretty bold agenda with universal care and affordability? Even if he starts with pilot programs, these numbers are going to loom large. How do you think he'll navigate that?
So, a few things. One, I always say this. My grandmother would always say, if we could put a man on the moon, we can figure this out. And by that, I mean, whenever we start talking about providing goods and resources to poor people or marginalized communities and trying to figure out how to make their lives better, it's like hand wringing. We can't figure it. We don't know how to do it. It's going to cost too much money. We can figure this out. We understand that essentially the mayor's budget is largely spoken for. And so there's a tiny bit of wiggle room. And this is why we see people defunding libraries and, sort of the low hanging fruit, because that's where you can sort of pull money. His bold agenda, which is taxing the rich, is something, and there are different ways that he can do it. It's not just one way that you can do it. I think has to be tried, honestly. And the question is always, but they'll leave. Where? Where are they going? They keep promising to leave and they never leave. They're not going to Passaic. They're not going to register in Florida. If they were, they would have already. And so this idea that we have to sort of be held hostage by rich people, wealthy people who actually can afford a small percentage to pay their fair share is something that he's he's willing to try. And because he didn't get into office with their donations, by and large, he's willing to do it. Most politicians get and stay in office because of those very same people, so they're not willing to do it. I think that we are past the time where we have to actually think creatively about this. The interesting thing is, rich people don't vote in municipal elections. Super rich people and super poor people don't vote because honestly, their lives don't change with whoever's in office. Rich people don't use public schools. They don't use public transportation. They don't use public parks. They don't use any sort of public resources. And their neighborhoods, by and large, are policed in such a way where they don't actually have to interact with the rest of New York if they don't really want to. It's a very, like, if you know New York, you know that there are these little enclaves that feel like little suburban places because they're quiet and they're insular, and you don't really see a lot of people coming in and out. There are these invisible boundaries that New York creates for a lot of folks. And essentially, Mamdani is saying, if you want to continue this life, you have to pay just a skosh more, a touch. And I think that'll open up things for his budget for him to be able to do a lot more for a lot of New Yorkers. And we've seen for the past 30 years, anytime anyone's even broached that conversation, it's, but they'll leave. And they haven't left. So, and they're not
Mm.
leaving. And if they do, we'll find more. There will be more. There are always more rich people, and there are always more rich people who want to live in New York. So we'll be fine.
And the last thing I wanted to ask comes to something you mentioned about how your comments always build on political science and scholarship. And you've been doing this for a while now, certainly since I met you. And I'm just curious if you can talk a little bit about how you try to you've always been in public TV, radio, now this podcast. How do you try to connect the two worlds of academia and helping people to understand what's going on in real time?
Yeah, I mean, so much, Julian, honestly, is I feel like, the Ivy Tower is real. And I never want to write something that, someone who does not have a PhD from Columbia University can't appreciate. I don't think, and so much of our work is complicated for no reason. In political science, we like use terms. And I'm like, why are we using a $5 word when a 10-cent word will do? And for me, especially as a Black woman, on one side of my family, my grandparents and my great grandparents went to college. Both grandmother and grandfather, great grandmother and great grandfather. And on the other side of my family, my grandmother had some of ninth grade and my grandfather had some of seventh grade. Two of the most brilliant people I've ever met, but just not from an academic
Mm.
institution lens. And I think that there's so many brilliant people who don't necessarily have the same pedigree and CVs that we do, but I want to make sure that I write in an accessible way. And so, like, when I first wrote Black Ethnics, I remember an academic was like, "Oh, your book is very accessible." And, in academia, that's a slight, right? And I was like, I'm glad my book is accessible. Like, I'm glad that someone who's not a PhD in political science can actually open up my books and like read my op-eds. And I've got a weekly column in the Amsterdam News, one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country, that like someone who's getting off the job at 1 in the morning and reads my column doesn't feel like they need to pull out a thesaurus to understand that I'm talking about their life. Right. And like
Mm.
things that matter to them. And so I think that the role of public scholarship is like slowly but surely becoming more acceptable in academia, but especially in political science, it is still we're lagging far, far behind in trying to translate so much of what we research to the public. And by that, I mean political science is very often disinterested in politics. I was in grad school. My second day of grad school was 9/11 in New York City. We spoke about 9/11 one time in one class, and it was down the street. And so that was my first real introduction to the fact that the academy sometimes does not care about people. They are data points and they are an N. And that is the antithesis as to why I want to be an educator. I'm from five generations of educators. So for me to view my privilege as an educator to close off information would be a disservice to all the ancestors that came before me who were educators.
Well, thank you for that. And I think you are a good antidote for some of the divisions that exist between the two worlds. And Christina Greer again, I just want to this podcast FAQ. Is it FAQ NYC or just FAQ? Oh, okay.
FAQ. We say FAQ
Okay.
NYC. You can just type in FAQ and you'll find it.
It's really fantastic,
Thank
and I
you.
urge you to read all your work and your articles and everything. But highlight, and I hope we can continue talking about New York politics as it unfolds. I think it's an exciting
Absolutely.
moment. Okay, thanks for
Absolutely.
joining, Christina.
Okay.
Bye
Thanks,
bye.
Julian.
Bye bye.